Hi everyone, in this video we're going to talk about instruction for students with dyslexia with an emphasis that students with dyslexia have the legal right to excellent education, free and appropriate education in a least restrictive environment, which means that the same educational goals, the same learning that you're holding all of your students accountable in the general education classroom, students with dyslexia have the right to that as well. So here's the definition of dyslexia as adopted by the International Dyslexia Association. This definition has been accepted widely by states throughout the United States. Most 50 states accept this, and the federal government, in fact, all 50 states really accept this, and the federal government also accepts this definition. Dyslexia is understood as a specific learning disability that is neurological in origin. It is characterized by difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. Secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. So again, the primary characteristics of dyslexia are inaccuracy in decoding, difficulty with word recognition, reading words with accuracy and fluency can be a struggle, and spelling can be a struggle. Dyslexia is primarily manifested by difficulty in learning to read, write, or spell, despite conventional instruction, and dyslexia is not associated with any kind of inadequacy in intelligence or socio-cultural opportunity. There may be some related disorders such as auditory imperceptions and developmental spelling disability. So remember that dyslexia is neurological in origin. It is lifelong. The core deficit is associated with phonological component of language. And typically students will struggle with word reading even if they're capable of reading comprehension. The core deficit is associated with phonological awareness. Phonological awareness, as you recall, is the understanding that words are made up of small bits of sound. For instance, the ability to tell that cat and fat sound the same at the end. The ability to answer the question, what is the first sound in the word man? Phonological awareness is innate in a typical brain receiving appropriate language education, language input. As we've been discussing in this class, phonemic awareness is the ability to identify, think about, and manipulate individual sounds in words. So phonemic awareness means that you have, as a child, a growing ability to identify individual sounds in words. If a child is struggling in that area, then that is a possible sign of dyslexia. Remember, as we've discussed before with dyslexia, it is associated with difficulty in decoding even if language comprehension is adequate. Because of the difficulty in decoding, children with dyslexia will typically struggle with phonics. Because remember, in order to be skilled in phonics, you need phonemic awareness, the ability to differentiate sounds in order to connect them with letters. Because remember, phonics is basically sound-symbol correspondence. When we understand dyslexia, in a normal reader, here's the way that basic language functions. You've got the ability to sound out words with auditory skills. You've got the ability to make sense of sight words, that's visual, and you've got uh, appropriate vocabulary and grammar skills, appropriate language comprehension skills. However, for students with dyslexia, there is struggle with the auditory and the sounding out of words, even if they're capable of making sense of sight words, language comprehension, vocabulary, and grammar. And that difficulty with sounding out causes difficulty in fluency and potentially difficulty with comprehension. Dyslexia can be detected in early childhood with a glitch in the child's ability to make sense of phonological awareness. So dyslexic readers have some, but not necessarily all, of the following symptoms that you see here. There may be struggling with listening comprehension. There may be difficulties with phonological awareness. In fact, phonological awareness is the key thing you would want to look for. There may be difficulty with memory for word sequences, for instance, phone numbers, directions. And there may be difficulty with finding words, making sense out of multi-syllable words, sequencing words, and sequencing sentences. There may be some other symptoms of dyslexia when it comes to writing. Perhaps the students might struggle with grammar, with appropriate speed and pace, with writing. When it comes to reading, the dyslexic students might struggle with the mechanics of reading, with comprehension as well as fluency. Oftentimes, when we talk about preschool students, students with dyslexia might be running behind when it comes to sensory motor skills, oral language, and attention. When we talk about early elementary, students with dyslexia might be running behind when it comes to print recognition and letter sound knowledge, as well as mechanics of reading and handwriting, as well as attention. Then we get to middle school or late elementary school. Oftentimes, students with dyslexia might be struggling with comprehension as well as written expression and attention. Students with dyslexia in high school might be struggling to efficiently read, that's fluency. They might be struggling with comprehension. And of course, attention might be a difficult area. Next, we get into assessment. You want to assess for strengths and weaknesses in your students. Now, typically when we talk about dyslexia, obviously, as I've stressed before, you are not being trained as a dyslexia specialist in this class, obviously. And so you're not going to be the one doing this very specialized assessment here when it comes to psychosocial and neurocognitive assessment that should be given for students who may be suspected to have dyslexia. Assessment should drive instruction as well as interventions. So when it comes to interventions, we want to address the phonological decoding as well as word level deficits of students in very explicit and systematic ways. Typically, multisensory instruction is provided that is explicit as well as systematic. And there would be multi-tiered systems of support such as RTI, with the problem being, though, that oftentimes RTI is inconsistent. From one school to another, you might find RTI being implemented in kind of different ways, which is a problem. There are certain challenges that we face. For instance, there's a lack of clarity in the field over the definition and diagnosis of dyslexia. For instance, even though I just said that the IDA's definition of dyslexia is widely accepted in state legislation as well as federal legislation. Um, when you look worldwide, there are debates about that definition, and when you look in the research literature, there are some debates about the definition, and that can lead to some lack of clarity. There's also some lack of clarity when it comes to assessment practices. That's beyond what I need you to get into in this class, but this lack of clarity for assessment practices for people who are dyslexia specialists can make effective intervention and effective practices kind of difficult to determine. There's still a great deal of debate in that area. So for you as a general education teacher, I just simply want you to know a basic overview of RTI because students at risk of dyslexia or who are identified with dyslexia will typically enter the RTI framework. All students, if 100% of your students, if your school has effective RTI, should receive Tier 1 support. Tier 1 is general education. Students that also need additional help will receive Tier 2 support in small groups. And then a small percent, typically maybe 5% or less, will receive one-on-one interventions more intensive in Tier 3. This is supposed to be ongoing by the time they reach Tier 3. But all students will undergo regular monitoring to determine whether they need Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3 support. When it comes to dyslexia, that screening that's supposed to be taking place is supposed to help us catch students who may have dyslexia in general education. RTI measures student skills and uses this data to decide which interventions are appropriate. The interventions can be part of class-wide instruction. The teacher can often break students into small groups. These groups are then tailored for different skill levels and different learning interests. Oftentimes, as general education, you would not be determining this on your own. You would be working with a specialist. Students who don't make enough progress during class may start to work on skills in Tier 2 RTI, small group intervention. As part of the RTI process, schools will help struggling students by using teaching interventions that have been shown to be effective. In Tier 1, that's general education, students would receive screening through what's called curriculum-based measures and other universal screeners. These have been identified, those students who are identified as at risk of dyslexia or other needs will receive interventions. Then we get into Tier 2. Tier 2 is is when a specialized intervention team will convene to identify the targeted curriculum modification and progress monitoring methods. As a general education teacher, you're not the one determining that, but you are responsible for adhering to the accommodations and modifications that are called for. The select most appropriate instructional tools will be targeted by this intervention team based upon screenings. Data from assessments will provide a closer look into the overall strengths, weaknesses, and needs of that student. The data will guide targeted instructional approaches and interventions. Progress monitoring is an essential component at this level. There should be comprehensive evaluation when a student enters Tier 2, Tier 3 RTI. So once interventions are implemented, student progress is monitored to determine whether the interventions are working, if interventions need to be changed, or whether additional detailed diagnostic testing is needed to further guide the selection and use of educational strategies. I'm not training you on diagnostic testing techniques in this class. After the screening process, there might be information that suggests a possible disability or possibly dyslexia. When a student does not respond to the targeted interventions at Tier 2, a referral may be needed to consider whether comprehensive individualized evaluation is required to enter Tier 3 RTI. This evaluation typically means examining various aspects of cognitive, emotional, and behavioral skills to understand those underlying processes. It's with tier 3 that students who may or may not have dyslexia would be systematically tested for dyslexia. There would be also systematic observation of how a student solves problems, for instance, reading problems, and this observation, as well as assessment, will provide detailed, specific information to aid in intervention as well as instruction and diagnosis. So at this point, an IEP might be crafted, and of course, you're not the one determining the IEP levels, but you are the one responsible for making sure that the IEP is followed in general education in your particular class. Accommodations are a different thing from interventions. An accommodation is a change to the classroom environment that gives students equal access to learning. Remember that free and appropriate public education principle that all students are required to have access to. And remember the principle of least restrictive environment, LRE, is a fundamental principle in exceptional education, which means that you're trying to make it so that you make appropriate accommodations so that students have access, even if they do have dyslexia, to the same high quality instruction that all of your students are receiving. So a struggling reader may use, for instance, text-to-speech software. This tool will read, of course, text aloud. This might not improve reading skills, but does help the student access the content in the book. Accommodations can be combined with interventions. In Tier 3, there is specific and very frequent progress monitoring that takes place to analyze whether the intervention is being effective or not. Interventions should be intentional, aimed at a particular challenge. They should be specific and formal. They should last a specific amount of time with progress reviewed at intervals. They should be flexible. If an intervention isn't helping, then there may be additional instructional time that would be added, or additional interventions, or otherwise adjustments made. Um, or possibly you can add more intense support, moving from small group to one-on-one assistance for that student. Remember, key thing here for dyslexia, treatment is most effective if students are identified at a young age. There should be intensive intervention. There should be explicit phonological as well as phonics instruction. And ideally, you look for those signs that I was looking for, including difficulty with attention. If a student has mild to severe dyslexia, that student is in need of more explicit phonics instruction, and there may be weaknesses when it comes to auditory working memory. If a student after third grade has mild to moderate dyslexia, then the intervention might be less intensive. Take care.